Hello everybody, and in this series we're going to talk about the endocrine system, and today we're going to focus on specifically the hypothalamus and work our way down throughout the different glands and see how they all affect each other, work together to keep our bodies working. So first, the hypothalamus. It's located deep in the middle brain, close to behind the eyes, and above the thalamus. That's where it gets its name, and it connects to the two pituitary glands underneath through the infundibulum, which is where the connections go through so that everything else can go throughout the body. Even though it is quite small, about 4 grams the size of an almond, about that big, it plays a very crucial role in keeping homeostasis in our body, in connecting two systems in our human body, the nervous system and the endocrine system. It takes peripheral signals from our nervous system and our environment, sends them into the hypothalamus, and converts those signals into chemicals and hormones that are being released throughout the body. Now, the pituitary gland has 2 parts, the anterior and a posterior. Now, the hypothalamus will send what are called releasing and inhibiting hormones to the anterior pituitary gland. These will either tell the anterior pituitary gland to release its own hormones or to stop releasing its own hormones. This is important to tell the difference. Now, between the posterior pituitary gland does not make its own hormones. All it does is it stores hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. The thalamus will make its own hormones, send it to the posterior pituitary gland, and it comes out from there. Whereas anterior, again, takes signals from hypothalamus to make its own hormones or to not release those hormones. And one of the important functions of the hypothalamus is to maintain homeostasis in the body. And one of the main important parts of homeostasis is body temperature. Now, similar to how a house uses a thermostat to increase or decrease the temperature regarding how hot or cold it is outside, the human body uses the hypothalamus, and it uses mechanisms mostly like sweating or shivering to do so. Sweating to cool us down, to bring out the sweat, cool out the temperature of our body, and shivering to warm us up, many muscle contractions. Now, the hypothalamus will receive these temperature informations from both the core of the body and also the periphery, the skin and our limbs, our hands and our feet. Now, whether it decides to increase or to decrease the temperature regards a mismatch. It's important, a mismatch between the temperature of the blood coming from the skin to the core and that blood in the core. So it depends on if there's a difference coming into the body versus the temperature that's already in the body, the core of the body, because there shouldn't be a big difference in the core. We all know that our hands and our feet, our nose and our ears are more susceptible to big differences in temperature. Now, the main effectors involved in these temperature adjustments include the skin's blood vessels, the cutaneous blood vessels, sweat glands for sweating, skeletal muscle for shivering, and brown fat. Brown fat is particularly unique because it's important for doing something called non-shivering thermogenesis. It's a way of warming us up without skeletal muscle contractions. And it does this in a way that it receives norepinephrine, one of the stress hormones, which is regulated by the sympathetic nervous system, to create that non-shivering thermogenesis. Now, another important part of homeostasis that the hypothalamus controls are feelings of appetite and satiety. It plays a major role in regulating hunger and fullness. Now, it's important to know that the hunger and full feelings in the body are not like an on and off switch. There are 2 different places that control feelings of hunger and one that control feelings of fullness. Now, one of the areas that, when activated, makes you feel full is called the ventral medial nucleus. And now here, when we're talking about nucleus, when I say the word nucleus, we're not talking about one single cell and the DNA inside the nucleus. Nucleus, in this sense, is going to be a cluster of cells. So the ventral medial nucleus is, when activated, makes you feel full. Now, this happens when food intake and even fat levels in the body reach a certain point, and a hormone called leptin is released, which is made by white adipose tissue, white fat tissue. Now, the leptin travels through the bloodstream and acts onto the ventral medial nucleus of the hypothalamus as well as the infundibular, or you'll also see it called the arcuate nucleus. And this is a helpful way that I found to remember leptin. Leptin sounds like lazy, L and L, so when you get really full, you feel lazy. So we know that the leptin acts on the ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus to make us feel full. Leptin, lazy, full. Now, the other part that when it's activated makes us feel hungry is the lateral hypothalamic area. Now, this responds to a hormone called ghrelin, and this hormone is made mostly by our stomach when it's empty and we haven't maybe eaten in a while, or maybe just before a meal it's preparing us for that meal. And the ghrelin acts on this lateral hypothalamus and even helps form memories associated with food. We know if we always eat at a certain time, maybe 30 minutes before, you'll start to feel the saliva forming in your mouth. You'll start to anticipate that meal. And the way that I remember ghrelin is, ghrelin sounds like gremlin. Some people, when they get hungry and hangry, they act like little gremlins. Now, another important part of homeostasis that the hypothalamus controls is heart rate and blood pressure. Now, these two aspects are going to be controlled by hormone release. One of the hormones that we're going to see talking about the hypothalamus and the endocrine system is called vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone, ADH. And you're going to probably mostly see it as ADH in your classroom. Now, this is going to be released from the posterior pituitary gland, but not made there. It's going to be made in the hypothalamus, sent to the posterior pituitary gland, and released from there. Whereas hormones from the anterior pituitary gland are going to be made when the hypothalamus sends hormone signals to tell the anterior to release its own hormones. Now, ADH is going to help with, as the name suggests, decreasing urine production, decreasing precipitation, and help with vasoconstriction of arterioles to raise the blood pressure. Now, that vasoconstriction, when we see that word vaso, talking about vessels, and the constriction, tightening them and making them smaller, will increase the pressure. If we decrease the volume, that pressure increases, and these differences are going to be sensed by sensory information from baroreceptors that are going to sense changes in the pressure, baro like barometer. These are also called mechanoreceptors, and also they're going to sense changes from different receptors called chemoreceptors. These are going to help modulate both the blood pressure and the heart rate in real time. And a helpful way that I remember ADH and what it does is ADH, add that hydrogen. And now we're going to talk about the hypothalamus and how it controls the different parts of the pituitary gland, both the anterior and the posterior. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about what these hormones do when released. We can do that in a separate video talking specifically about anterior and posterior pituitary gland. But I want to talk about right now how it uses different systems to send those hormones down that path. Now, the hypothalamus is going to communicate with the anterior pituitary gland using the hypophyseal portal system, which is basically just a network of blood vessels. And it's going to transport those releasing and inhibiting hormones to the anterior pituitary gland. And these hormones then stimulate or suppress hormone production in the anterior pituitary gland. Now, those hormones are thyrotropin releasing hormone made in the hypothalamus, which tells the anterior pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, whenever we see the word tropin in a word, like thyrotropin, tropin we know means affinity, so it's going to have an affinity for something. Thyrotropin, it's going to have an affinity, or it's going to want to go to the thyroid, which makes sense because this hormone stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Next hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone made in the hypothalamus stimulates the release of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. Next one is corticotropin releasing hormone. Corticotropin, we know that that's going to mean that it's going to have to do with the adrenal system, and this is going to stimulate the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. Next one, growth hormone releasing hormone, stimulates growth hormone. Somatostatin is not going to be a releasing hormone. This is going to be an inhibitor. This is going to be what inhibits that GH, the growth hormone. And also one that we all have heard before, it has many different functions, but now we're just talking about in relation to hypothalamus. Dopamine, made in the hypothalamus, is going to be an inhibitor for prolactin. And we're going to see now in the posterior pituitary gland how the hypothalamus sends different hormones through there and how they're sent out to the rest of the body. Now, this posterior pituitary, again, does not make its own hormones. All it does is that it takes hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus and it stores them and releases them in the posterior pituitary gland. Now, the two that we're going to talk about are vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone that we saw when talking about heart rate and blood pressure, which again involves water balance, blood pressure regulation. Another one is oxytocin, and this is going to play an important role in childbirth and bonding. It also has to do with the ejection of breast milk, and we'll see how there's two different hormones that have to do with production of breast milk, which is prolactin. The way that I remember it is prolactin has to do with production of breast milk, and oxytocin is actually what ejects it.
So what kind of hormone does the hypothalamus send to the anterior pituitary gland?
The hypothalamus sends two types of hormones to the anterior pituitary gland. They're called either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. So it tells the anterior pituitary to either release its own hormones or it inhibits, it stops the release of certain hormones. So the anterior pituitary gland needs control from the hypothalamus and it needs orders before it releases its own hormones.
Which pituitary gland makes its own hormones?
The anterior pituitary gland makes its own. It needs directions from the hypothalamus to make them. The posterior pituitary gland does not make its own. It takes hormones from the hypothalamus that are produced there and they're sent to the posterior pituitary to be stored and released from there.
Which hormone makes us feel full?
The hormone leptin is what makes us feel full. When the levels of food or fat tissue increase at a certain level, it releases the hormone leptin, which is made in the white adipose tissue, and it acts on the ventral medial part of the hypothalamus. And remember, leptin equals lazy. If you eat a lot of food, you feel lazy. Leptin.
And which hormone makes us feel hungry?
The hormone that makes us feel hungry is ghrelin. This is made in our stomach when our stomach is empty and we haven't eaten, or if we're anticipating a certain meal, we'll usually 30 minutes before a meal, you start to feel hungry or get that sensation of saliva building up. We get ghrelin produced by the stomach and it acts on the lateral hypothalamic area. Remember, ghrelin, gremlin. Some people act like gremlins when they're hungry.
What is another word for antidiuretic hormone?
Vasopressin is also the same thing as antidiuretic hormone. ADH, vasopressin.
What two hormones are stimulated by gonadotropin?
The two hormones that are stimulated by gonadotropin releasing hormone are FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. Again, the gonadotropin hormone is made in the hypothalamus and it stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to make FSH and LH.
What inhibits prolactin?
Dopamine. Dopamine inhibits prolactin.
What is oxytocin important for?
Oxytocin is important for contractions during childbirth, and it also helps with the ejection of breast milk. Not the production. Remember, production of breast milk is prolactin, and then the ejection is from oxytocin.